My husband raised his glass and thanked everyone for coming, then looked straight at Emily and said she had never contributed a single thing to his success. The laughter came quickly, polite at first, then warmer as a few people leaned back in their chairs, comfortable in the rhythm Daniel had set for the evening, and Emily Carter sat there at the end of the long white tablecloth, her hands resting lightly beside her plate, her wine untouched, her expression unchanged, as if the words had landed somewhere just beyond her, not quite reaching the surface, not yet. The restaurant was one of those downtown places where reservations were hard to get, the kind with low amber lighting, polished wood, and a soft jazz trio playing somewhere near the bar, the air carrying a faint mix of seared steak, butter, and expensive cologne, and around them, other tables buzzed with quiet conversations, silverware tapping gently against porcelain, the steady hum of a Friday night that felt curated, controlled, predictable, everything Daniel liked. He sat at the center, naturally, one arm draped across the back of his chair, his posture relaxed, confident, the posture of a man who believed the room belonged to him, and maybe it did, at least for now, because people were watching him, nodding along, smiling when he smiled, waiting for his next line like it mattered. "You know how it is," he continued, swirling the last of his bourbon, his voice carrying just enough to keep the table engaged without drawing attention from the rest of the room. "Some people are just better suited to enjoying the rewards than building anything themselves." And this time the laughter came easier, a few glances flicking toward Emily, quick, curious, measuring her reaction, but she didn't give them one. She simply reached for her water glass, took a small, steady sip and set it back down with quiet precision. Across from her, a woman Daniel had introduced earlier as a colleague let out a soft laugh, tilting her head slightly, the kind of gesture that looked harmless but wasn't, and to Emily's right, one of the investors shifted in his seat, not uncomfortable exactly, just aware, like he had stepped into something he hadn't fully expected. Daniel didn't pause, didn't hesitate, because he wasn't finished, not yet, and that was the part that mattered, not the first comment, but the way he layered it, turning a moment into a narrative, a story that positioned him exactly where he wanted to be. "I mean, look," he added, gesturing lightly with his glass. "We all make choices, right? Some of us take risks, build something from nothing, and some of us," he glanced at Emily again, this time holding it a second longer, "get comfortable along the way." A few more smiles, a couple of low chuckles, the kind people use when they're not sure how far they're allowed to go. And still Emily didn't react, she didn't correct him, didn't interrupt, didn't defend herself, she simply sat there, composed, her posture straight, her breathing even, as if she were listening to something entirely different, something only she could hear. The server approached then, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, the quiet choreography of fine dining continuing uninterrupted, and for a moment the conversation drifted. Someone asked about a recent project, another mentioned a trip to Napa, and Daniel leaned into it easily, transitioning as if nothing had happened, as if the earlier comments were just harmless humor, already fading into the background, but the air had shifted, just slightly, just enough that a few people kept glancing back at Emily, waiting, wondering, expecting something, anything. She gave them nothing. She folded her napkin more neatly in her lap, glanced briefly toward the far end of the room where the manager stood near the bar, then back to her plate, her expression calm, almost distant, and if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have noticed that she wasn't shrinking, wasn't retreating, she was simply waiting. And Daniel, confident in the silence he had created, mistook it for agreement, for weakness, for the kind of quiet that meant he had already won, and that was his first mistake. The conversation moved on as if nothing had happened, but the tone never fully returned to what it had been before. There was a slight hesitation in the way people spoke, a carefulness in their laughter, and Daniel seemed to enjoy that even more, leaning into each question, answering with the same easy confidence, occasionally slipping in another comment that circled back to the same idea without repeating it directly, reinforcing the version of Emily he had already presented. And each time he did, a few people smiled, a few nodded, and a few avoided looking at her altogether, which told her more than any words could. Emily noticed everything, the way the investor across from her adjusted his watch when Daniel spoke, the way the woman beside him leaned in just a little closer when he laughed, the way the server hesitated half a second longer near her side of the table before moving on, as if waiting for a signal that never came, and she kept her expression steady, her movements precise, her presence contained, not small, not withdrawn, just controlled. Daniel began talking about a recent deal then, something about expansion, about timing, about how he had managed to secure a partnership others had missed, And his voice shifted slightly, gaining weight, drawing attention again. This was his territory, the part where he expected admiration, and the table responded accordingly. Questions, interest, approval, the kind of energy that builds around someone who appears to be winning. Emily listened, but not to the story itself. She listened to the details he chose to include and the ones he left out. She listened to the names he mentioned and the ones he avoided. And once, just once, she allowed her eyes to move toward the far side of the room again, toward the manager, who was now speaking quietly with someone near the kitchen entrance. A brief exchange, a nod, and then a glance in her direction that lasted only a moment before it disappeared. Back at the table, Daniel was finishing his explanation. It all came down to knowing when to step in, he said, lifting his glass slightly as if punctuating the point, and when to let things play out. And there was a small ripple of agreement. Someone said that was exactly right. Someone else asked how long he had been working on it, and Daniel gave a modest shrug that did not quite hide the satisfaction underneath. Long enough, he replied, to make sure it paid off. Emily reached for her fork then, cutting a small piece of the steak in front of her, though she had barely touched it, and took a bite, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, as if she were considering something far more important than the conversation, and in a way she was. The woman across from her finally spoke directly to her, her tone light, almost curious. So Emily, what do you think about all of this? It was the first time anyone had addressed her since the earlier remarks, and the table shifted subtly, attention redirecting, waiting again, and Emily looked up, meeting her gaze without hesitation, her voice calm even. I think timing matters, she said, nothing more, nothing less, and for a second it was not clear how to respond to that. The answer was too simple, too neutral, offering no angle, no reaction, no confirmation of the role Daniel had assigned her. And the woman gave a small nod, smiling as if that had been enough. Daniel let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head slightly. That is one way to put it, he said, dismissing it gently, turning the focus back to himself, but something in his expression flickered, just briefly, something that suggested he had expected more, or perhaps hoped for it, something he could respond to, something he could control. The plates were cleared not long after, one by one, the rhythm of the evening continuing, the soft scrape of porcelain, the quiet efficiency of the staff, and as the last of the dinner dishes disappeared, there was a pause, a natural break, the kind that usually invites lighter conversation, but instead it settled into a subtle stillness, as if the table itself was waiting for the next move. Emily placed her hands lightly on the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and somewhere in the background, the music shifted to a slower piece, softer, almost unnoticeable, and that was when the first sign appeared, small enough that most people missed it, the manager stepping away from the bar and moving toward their table, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, and for the first time that evening, Emily allowed herself the smallest pause before breathing in, because the part Daniel believed he controlled was almost over, and he still did not know it. The manager stopped just short of the table, his posture composed, his hands loosely folded in front of him, the kind of stance that suggested both professionalism and intention, and for a moment he did not speak. He simply looked at Emily, not Daniel, not the others, just Emily, as if confirming something that had already been decided elsewhere, and she met his gaze briefly, almost imperceptibly, a small acknowledgement that passed between them without drawing attention, at least not yet. Then he turned slightly, offering a polite smile to the table. I hope everything has been to your satisfaction this evening, he said, his voice measured, calm, the standard line delivered in a way that felt just a little more deliberate than usual, and Daniel was the first to respond, of course, leaning back in his chair with an easy confidence. Everything has been excellent, he said, nodding once as if granting approval, and a few others echoed the sentiment, murmured agreements, polite affirmations, the expected rhythm of a well-managed dinner. The manager inclined his head, accepting the responses, but he did not leave. Instead, he shifted his attention back toward Emily, just slightly, enough that anyone paying attention would notice the change in focus, and that was when the first ripple of confusion moved through the table, subtle but real. We have prepared something special to conclude your evening, he continued, and now there was a faint shift in tone, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to suggest that this was not part of the standard service, and Daniel's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again, curiosity replacing certainty, because this was not something he had arranged, and he was used to being the one who arranged things. Emily did not move, she did not speak, she simply listened, her hand still resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her calm intact. Behind the manager, two servers approached, each carrying a tray, their movements synchronized, careful and precise, and as they stepped closer, the conversation at the table faded on its own, voices lowering, then stopping entirely, because attention had shifted whether anyone intended it or not. The first plate was set down in front of Emily, not in front of Daniel, not in the center of the table directly in front of her. And it was not just a dessert, it was presented differently, more detailed, more intentional, the kind of plating that usually came with an explanation. And the second server placed additional plates in front of the others, similar but not identical, each one following the same theme, but clearly secondary to the one placed before Emily. A quiet stillness settled over the table, the kind that does not come from discomfort but from anticipation, from the sense that something is about to be revealed, even if no one can quite name what it is yet. The manager remained where he was, his attention still centered on Emily, and then in a tone that carried just enough to reach everyone at the table without extending beyond it, he spoke again. "Miss Carter, the chef asked me to personally thank you," he said, and the words landed differently than anything that had been said that evening, because they did not fit the narrative Daniel had been building, not even slightly. There was a pause, small but undeniable, and several heads turned toward Emily at once, the shift immediate, the attention now unmistakably on her, and Daniel's hand, still resting on the back of his chair, went still. Emily lifted her gaze slowly, meeting the manager's eyes, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if this moment had always been part of the evening, as if nothing about it surprised her at all. "You are very kind," she said, her voice even, controlled, the same tone she had used all night, and the manager inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect rather than courtesy, and that difference, though subtle, did not go unnoticed. Around the table, the earlier confidence had begun to shift into something else, something quieter, more uncertain, because the roles they thought they understood were no longer aligning, and Daniel, for the first time that evening, did not immediately fill the silence. He looked at the plate in front of Emily, then at the manager, then back at her, as if trying to piece together a detail he had missed, something that should have been obvious but was not, and the absence of explanation unsettled him more than any direct contradiction could have. Emily picked up her fork then, not rushed, not hesitant, and glanced down at the dessert for a brief moment before looking back up, her gaze moving across the table, meeting each pair of eyes that now watched her with a different kind of attention, and she did not rush to explain, did not offer context, did not correct anything that had been said earlier. She simply allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the shift to fully settle in, because by the time anyone thought to ask a question, the answer would already be obvious, and Daniel still did not know what that answer was. No one spoke right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not awkward, not accidental, but controlled, like a pause placed exactly where it needed to be, and Emily let it settle fully before she moved again, her fork lowering gently onto the edge of the plate, her gaze still calm, still steady, as if the shift happening around the table was something she had already accounted for long before anyone else noticed it. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, and leaned forward just slightly, his expression adjusting into something that resembled curiosity, though it did not quite hide the tension beginning to form beneath it. "That is unexpected," he said, forcing a light tone, a half smile that did not fully reach his eyes, and a few people at the table gave polite nods, as if agreeing without understanding what exactly they were agreeing to. The manager remained composed, his attention still angled toward Emily rather than Daniel, and that detail did not go unnoticed, not anymore. "The chef rarely prepares this selection unless specifically requested," he added, his voice even, measured, and now the words carried weight, not because of how they were said, but because of what they implied, and the implication hung there, unspoken but clear enough that it began to rearrange the assumptions that had been made earlier in the evening. Emily did not rush to respond, she simply gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without expanding on it, without offering explanation, and that restraint did more than any long answer could have. Across the table, the investor who had been watching quietly all night leaned back slightly, studying her now with a different kind of focus, no longer casual, no longer passive, and beside him, the woman who had laughed earlier lowered her gaze to her plate, her expression tightening just a fraction, as if recalibrating something she had already decided. Daniel let out a short breath, then laughed lightly, attempting to recover the tone he had set earlier. "Well, looks like someone has connections," he said, gesturing loosely toward Emily, and the comment landed, but not the way he intended because no one laughed this time, not immediately, not easily, and the absence of that response was louder than anything that had come before. Emily turned her head slightly toward him then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the beginning of the evening, and there was nothing sharp in her expression, nothing confrontational, just a quiet clarity that held for a second longer than expected before she spoke. Not connections, she said calmly, her voice even controlled. Responsibility. The word settled into the space between them, simple, precise, and for a moment, it did not seem to register, not fully, as if it needed time to be understood. And that was when the manager spoke again, gently reinforcing what she had not elaborated. Miss Carter has been instrumental in the development of this location, he said, his tone respectful, factual, without embellishment, and the effect was immediate, a visible shift across the table, shoulders straightening, expressions tightening, attention sharpening, because the narrative that had been presented earlier no longer aligned with the information now being introduced. Daniel's smile faltered just slightly, his hand dropping from the back of his chair to the table as he looked from the manager to Emily, then back again, searching for something that would restore his footing, but nothing came, not yet. Emily did not fill the silence, she did not explain further, she simply reached for her fork again, cutting into the dessert with the same steady precision she had shown all evening, as if the conversation unfolding around her was secondary to something already decided. One of the guests finally spoke, his voice careful, measured. "You are involved with the restaurant?" he asked, directing the question toward her, and Emily looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "In a way," she replied, and again she stopped there, offering just enough to confirm, not enough to define, and that restraint pulled the attention tighter rather than releasing it. The manager inclined his head slightly, as if that answer was sufficient, and stepped back just enough to signal that his role in the moment was complete, but he did not leave entirely, remaining within view, present, observant. Daniel leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence no longer as fluid, his posture adjusting in small ways that only someone paying close attention would notice, and for the first time that evening, he did not speak immediately, he waited, and in that waiting something shifted, something quiet but irreversible, because the version of the story he had been telling no longer held, and he had not been the one to change it. No one corrected the manager, and that absence of correction settled deeper than any explanation could have, because it confirmed something without needing to say it outright, and the table responded to that confirmation in quiet, visible ways, a straightened posture here, a more careful glance there, the subtle recalibration of how people were choosing to see Emily Carter now, not as someone being described by Daniel, but as someone they had clearly misunderstood. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the edge of his glass before he stopped himself, the movement small but telling, and he forced another smile, lighter this time, more controlled. "Well," he said, letting out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, "you never mentioned that." And he turned toward Emily as if the statement carried weight, as if it implied omission, but the room did not move with him, not this time. Emily looked at him, her expression steady, unhurried, and for a second she said nothing, letting the question linger just long enough to lose its edge before she answered. "You never asked," she said simply, her tone calm, not sharp, not defensive, just precise, and that precision landed more cleanly than any argument could have. A few people at the table exchanged quick glances, subtle but unmistakable, because the dynamic had shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to make it clear that the balance was no longer where it had been at the start of the evening. The investor across from her leaned forward slightly now, his interest no longer casual. "When you say responsible," he said carefully, choosing his words, "what exactly does that mean?" And this time the question was directed fully at Emily, without hesitation, without filtering through Daniel first. Emily rested her fork lightly against the plate, her posture unchanged, and considered the question for a brief moment, not because she needed time to answer, but because she understood the value of timing. "It means I make decisions that affect outcomes," she said, her voice even, controlled, and again, she stopped there, offering clarity without expansion, leaving space for the implication to settle on its own. The manager, still standing just within reach, added quietly, "Miss Carter oversees several of the investment groups that supported this location, and now the statement carried structure, something more concrete, something that could not be easily dismissed or reinterpreted, and the effect was immediate, a visible shift in how the table held itself, because this was no longer a vague connection or a passing involvement, it was authority. Daniel's expression tightened, not enough to draw attention directly, but enough that it no longer matched the relaxed confidence he had worn earlier, and he leaned back again, his hand returning to the back of his chair as if reclaiming a position that no longer fit as easily. "That is impressive," he said, the words measured slower than before, as if he were testing them, and a few others nodded quickly, offering agreement that felt more genuine now, less automatic, more deliberate. The woman who had laughed earlier looked up again, her tone softer this time, more careful. "I had no idea," she said, and it was not entirely clear whether she was speaking to Emily or to herself, but the admission lingered all the same. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without reinforcing it, without softening it, and returned her attention briefly to the dessert in front of her, taking another measured bite, as if the conversation unfolding around her required no urgency from her at all. Daniel watched her, his gaze more focused now, less certain, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer aligned, the one he had described and the one now being revealed, and the gap between those versions was beginning to show in ways he could not easily control. "So this whole time," he said, attempting to regain some footing, "you were just keeping that to yourself?" And the question carried something new, not quite accusation, not quite curiosity, something in between, something unsettled. Emily looked at him again, her expression unchanged, and this time there was a faint pause before she answered, not hesitation but intention. "I was waiting," she said quietly, and the words settled into the space with a weight that was not immediately understood, but clearly felt, and for the first time that evening Daniel did not respond right away, because whatever he had expected this dinner to be, it was no longer that, and he could feel it slipping in ways he did not yet know how to stop. The word lingered longer than anything else that had been said that night, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exact, and Daniel felt it before he understood it, the shift, the loss of control, the quiet realization that whatever had been unfolding was not accidental, and that Emily had not been reacting because she had never intended to. He let out a small breath through his nose, his fingers tightening briefly around the stem of his glass before he set it down, more carefully than necessary, and leaned forward just slightly, his tone adjusting again, softer now, measured. "Waiting for what?" he asked, and for the first time there was no laughter underneath his voice, no performance, just a question that did not fully belong to him anymore. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a moment, not with challenge, not with judgment, just with a steady clarity that seemed to remove everything unnecessary from the room, and then she shifted her gaze slightly, not away, but past him, toward the others at the table, as if acknowledging that the question was no longer private, that it belonged to the room now. "For the right moment," she said calmly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than explanation would have, because everyone at the table could feel that the moment had already arrived, whether they had recognized it or not. The investor leaned back again, slower this time, his expression thoughtful, no longer evaluating Emily through Daniel's lens, but through his own, and the woman beside him adjusted her posture, her earlier ease replaced with a more careful attention, as if she were now choosing each reaction instead of following the tone that had been set for her. Daniel exhaled quietly, nodding once as if acknowledging the answer, though it did not restore anything for him, and he glanced briefly around the table, perhaps expecting someone to step in, to redirect, to normalize the moment, but no one did because the direction had already changed. "Well," he said after a second, attempting to gather what remained of his earlier rhythm, "I suppose that explains the surprise," and the word landed flat, not incorrect but no longer effective because the surprise was no longer the dessert, it was everything surrounding it. Emily did not correct him, she did not need to, she simply reached for her glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with the same controlled precision, her movements unchanged despite the shift in the room. The manager stepped forward again then, just enough to re-enter the edge of the conversation, his tone still calm, still respectful. "Miss Carter has been working on this project for over 18 months, he said, offering a detail that anchored everything more firmly in reality, and the number settled into the table with quiet significance, because it suggested time, planning, consistency, none of which aligned with the version of Emily that had been described earlier in the evening. A few people nodded slowly, processing, recalibrating, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he forced it to relax again, his eyes returning to Emily with a focus that was no longer casual. 18 months, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it, and she gave a small nod, confirming without elaborating, without shifting her tone, because she did not need to add anything more. The woman across from her spoke again, her voice softer now, more careful than before. "That is a long time to keep something like that quiet," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only recognition, and Emily met her gaze briefly, acknowledging the statement. "It was not necessary to discuss," she replied simply, and again she stopped there, leaving the implication to settle on its own. And the implication was clear enough now that no one needed it spelled out. Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his hand no longer draped casually but resting against the table, his posture adjusting in small, controlled ways that revealed more than he intended, and for a moment, he said nothing, which in itself said more than any comment could have earlier. Around them, the restaurant continued as it always had, glasses clinking softly, quiet conversations resuming at other tables, the steady rhythm of a place that did not change for any one group, and yet at this table, everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by explanation, not by humor, not by reclaiming control, because control had never been where Daniel believed it was. Emily placed her fork down gently, her dessert nearly untouched now, and looked once more around the table, meeting each person's gaze briefly, not seeking approval, not demanding recognition, simply acknowledging the new balance that had settled into place, and then she looked back at Daniel, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, as if nothing about this outcome had surprised her at all because it had not. The silence no longer felt uncertain, it felt defined, like something had been drawn clearly across the table and everyone could see it now, even if no one was willing to name it out loud, and Emily did not move to fill it. She let it exist, let it settle into each person differently, because she understood that once people saw something for themselves, they did not forget it. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his chair making the faintest sound against the floor as he adjusted his position, and he gave a small nod as if concluding something internally, then reached for his glass, taking a longer drink than before, the motion slower, more deliberate, as if buying himself a moment to recalibrate. "Well," he said after setting it down, his voice steady but no longer carrying the same effortless confidence, "that certainly adds context." And the words were careful, chosen, but they did not carry the same authority they had earlier. They sounded like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground, testing each step before committing to it. No one immediately responded, and that lack of response stretched just long enough to make it clear that the conversation was no longer orbiting him. The investor spoke next, not to Daniel but directly to Emily, his tone respectful, engaged. "What made you choose this location?" he asked, and the shift in direction was unmistakable. The question was no longer about reacting to what had happened, it was about understanding her decisions, her thinking, her role. Emily looked at him, her expression unchanged, calm, attentive, and she answered without hesitation. "Timing and positioning," she said, her voice even measured. "The area is transitioning and the model supports long-term stability," and unlike before, she allowed the answer to extend just slightly, not into explanation, but into clarity, enough to establish substance without losing control. The investor nodded slowly, absorbing it, and another guest leaned in, following the same line of inquiry, asking about projections, about partnerships, about how the concept would scale, and Emily answered each question the same way, concise, precise, never rushed, never overextended, and with each answer, the dynamic at the table continued to shift, not abruptly but steadily, like a current that had changed direction and would not be pulled back. Daniel watched, his gaze moving between Emily and the others, and there was something new in his expression now, not just uncertainty but recognition, the understanding that the space he had occupied earlier was no longer his by default, that it had to be earned in a way he had not anticipated. He leaned forward slightly, attempting to re-enter the conversation. "We have actually been discussing expansion in that sector as well," he said, directing his comment toward the investor, but his tone carried a subtle strain, a need to re-establish relevance, and the investor nodded politely, acknowledging him, but then turned back to Emily. "I would be interested to hear how you structured the initial investment," he said, and the redirection was gentle, but unmistakable. Emily did not react to the shift, she simply continued, outlining the framework in the same controlled manner, her voice steady, her words deliberate, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that this was not new to her, not a recent development, but something she had been operating within for a long time, quietly, consistently, without needing to announce it. The woman who had laughed earlier now listened without interruption, her posture more reserved, her attention focused, as if recalibrating not just her opinion, but her place within the conversation itself. The manager remained at a distance now, no longer needing to reinforce anything, because the room had already adjusted, the information had settled, and the hierarchy that had been assumed at the start of the evening had been quietly, completely rewritten. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hand resting flat against the table now, no longer draped, no longer casual, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing immediate to say that would restore what had been lost. Emily finished answering the last question, then allowed the conversation to move naturally, not holding it, not controlling it, simply existing within it with the same quiet certainty she had maintained from the beginning. And as the voices around the table resumed, as the rhythm of the evening found a new balance, it became clear to everyone present that the moment had already passed, the one Daniel thought he had created, and something else had taken its place, something quieter, stronger, and far more difficult to undo. By the time the conversation settled into its new rhythm, it was no longer centered around proving anything. It was about understanding, and that shift was the part Daniel could not quite regain control over, because it had happened without confrontation, without argument, without any clear moment he could point to and correct. He sat there, listening now more than speaking, his posture composed but no longer relaxed, his attention fixed on Emily in a way it had not been earlier, as if he were trying to map the distance between what he thought he knew and what was now undeniable. Across the table, the investor continued asking questions, each one more specific than the last, about timelines, about risk exposure, about how she had positioned the capital across different phases, and Emily answered with the same measured clarity, her tone steady, her words precise, never rushing, never filling space unnecessarily, and the more she spoke, the more the structure of her role became visible, not just involvement, not just support, but leadership, the kind that did not need to be announced because it was evident in the way she thought. And the original funding? The investor asked, leaning forward slightly. Did you consolidate through a single group or multiple entries? Emily set her glass down before answering, her movements consistent, controlled. Multiple entries, she said. It allowed for flexibility during the early stage and reduced pressure on any single channel, and she paused just briefly, then added, it also gave me room to adjust without external interference, and the phrasing was careful, but the implication was clear enough that the investor nodded with visible approval. Daniel shifted again, this time leaning in slightly as if preparing to contribute. We have been looking at similar structures, he said, his tone steady but more deliberate now, especially in emerging areas, and for a moment the attention hovered uncertain before the investor acknowledged him with a brief nod, then turned back to Emily. Did you encounter resistance early on? He asked, and the redirection, once again, was quiet but unmistakable. Emily did not react to it, she simply answered, of course, she said, her tone even. There is always resistance when the timing is not obvious to everyone. And she let the sentence rest there, not expanding, not qualifying, and the table absorbed it in silence for a second longer than usual. The woman who had spoken earlier glanced at Daniel, then back at Emily, her expression thoughtful now, no trace of the earlier ease. And you handled that alone? She asked, and there was something different in the question, not skepticism but recognition, as if she were trying to understand the scope rather than challenge it. Emily met her gaze briefly, then nodded once. I prefer to, she said, and that was all, and again it was enough. Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers resting flat against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer searching for rhythm, and he gave a small nod, as if agreeing with something that had not been directed at him. That explains a lot, he said quietly, and for the first time there was no attempt to frame the statement, no attempt to shape how it would be received, it simply existed, and no one responded immediately, because there was nothing left to reinterpret. Around them the restaurant continued as it always had, the soft clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, the distant sound of the jazz trio shifting into another piece, but at the table the atmosphere had settled into something far more defined, not tense, not uncomfortable, but clear, like a surface that had finally stopped moving. Emily placed her fork down, her dessert still mostly untouched, and folded her napkin neatly beside her plate, a small, deliberate action that seemed to signal something without announcing it. And she glanced briefly toward the manager, who was still within view, observing without intruding, and gave a slight nod, barely noticeable but enough. The manager responded immediately, stepping forward again with the same composed posture. Whenever you are ready, he said quietly, his tone directed toward Emily rather than the table, and the phrasing, simple as it was, carried weight, because it suggested that the conclusion of the evening was not being dictated by the group, but by her. Daniel noticed it, of course, the wording, the direction, the subtle deference, and his expression tightened for just a moment before smoothing out again. But the pause had already been seen. Emily reached for her glass one last time, taking a small sip, then set it down carefully, her movements unhurried, controlled, and she looked around the table once more, meeting each person's gaze briefly, acknowledging them without seeking anything from them, and then she stood. The motion was calm, fluid, without hesitation, and it shifted the energy at the table immediately, chairs moving slightly as others adjusted, attention following her without question, and for a moment no one spoke because the structure of the evening had already changed, and everyone understood it, even if they had not expected it. Daniel remained seated for a second longer than the others, watching her, his expression no longer confident, no longer dismissive, but something quieter, something more aware, and then he stood as well, slower, more measured, as if adjusting to a pace that was no longer his own, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone at the table that whatever had begun earlier in the evening had not ended the way he intended, and he had only just realized it. The movement of chairs was soft but unmistakable, a quiet chain reaction as others began to stand as well, some out of courtesy, some out of instinct, and a few simply because the center of the evening had shifted and they were following it without fully realizing why. And Emily did not rush, she adjusted her jacket slightly, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, as if this moment was no different from any other decision she had made that night, controlled, deliberate, complete. The manager stepped forward again, this time with a small folder in hand, the kind typically used for final bills, but he did not place it in the center of the table, he did not slide it toward Daniel. Instead, he walked directly to Emily and held it out to her with quiet respect. "Whenever you are ready," he repeated, and the repetition carried meaning now because it confirmed what had already been implied, that the conclusion of the evening belonged to her. A few of the guests glanced at Daniel instinctively, waiting for him to intercept the moment, to redirect it, to re-establish the pattern they had assumed from the beginning, but he did not move, not immediately, because for the first time that night, he was not certain how. Emily accepted the folder without hesitation, her fingers closing around it lightly, as if it weighed nothing, and she opened it with the same measured calm she had shown throughout the evening, her eyes scanning the contents briefly, not because she needed to verify it, but because she understood the value of completing the gesture fully. Daniel took a small step forward. Then, his voice steady but lower than before. "Emily, that is not necessary," he said, and the words were careful, chosen, carrying a tone that suggested both correction and restraint, as if he were trying to recover a role that no longer fit as easily as it once had. Emily did not look up right away, she finished closing the folder, then lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression calm, her voice even. "It already was," she said, and the simplicity of the response left no space for negotiation, no room for reinterpretation. It was not a challenge, it was a statement, and it settled exactly where it needed to. The investor watched the exchange closely, his expression thoughtful, and the woman beside him shifted slightly, her earlier confidence replaced with a quiet attentiveness that did not miss anything now. Not the tone, not the timing, not the way Daniel's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly as he absorbed the response. Emily handed the folder back to the manager, her movements smooth, unhurried, and he accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said, and the use of her name, clear and direct, carried more weight now than it had earlier, because everyone at the table understood exactly why it was said that way. The manager stepped away, and the moment closed without ceremony, without announcement, but its impact remained, steady and undeniable. For a second, no one spoke, and then the investor extended his hand toward Emily, his tone respectful, sincere. "I would appreciate the opportunity to continue this conversation sometime," he said, and the shift was complete, no longer subtle, no longer implied, and Emily accepted the gesture with a small nod. "That can be arranged," she replied, her voice unchanged, calm, controlled, and the clarity of it left no doubt that she meant it. Others followed, brief acknowledgments, polite exchanges, but each one carried a different weight now, more intentional, more aware, and Daniel stood slightly apart from it, close enough to be part of the group, but no longer at its center, his presence adjusted without anyone needing to say it. He looked at Emily, then really looked at her, as if seeing her fully for the first time that evening, not through assumption, not through habit, but through what had been revealed piece by piece, and there was a moment, brief but real, where something shifted in his expression. Not defeat, not apology, something quieter. Something that suggested understanding arriving too late to change anything. Emily met his gaze for a second, no longer avoiding it, no longer waiting, just acknowledging it. And then she turned slightly, stepping away from the table, her movement calm, unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in question. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the polished floor as she walked, the sound of quiet conversations blending back into the background, the evening continuing as it always would for everyone else, but for those at that table, the moment remained clear and fixed, something they would not forget, because they had watched it happen without interruption, without escalation, without a single raised voice. Daniel remained where he was for a second longer, his hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, and then he followed, slower, more measured, no longer leading, and that was the difference that stayed, not what had been said, not even what had been revealed, but who had controlled the moment from beginning to end, and who had only realized it when it was already over.